Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's nice to see your faces. Today's event, as you already know, is called Slavery and Christianity: Jonathan Edwards' Journey from Slaver to Early Abolitionist. We are your MCs. My name is Fiona, and this is Derek. The images that you may have been seeing just now on the slides illustrate some realities of slavery in Edwards' time, the 1700s, and they may have disturbed you. And if they have, you're not alone. I urge you not to bury your feelings of unease, but to wrestle with them. Let them move you to grapple with how the legacy of slavery continues to impact our society, both black and white people, even today. In a minute, we will have opening remarks from Jim Nash, the president of the Northampton City Council, and then we'll have our first talk by historian Elizabeth Sharp, followed by Elise Bernier-Feely, our second historian. We will then have some time for questions from the audience to our historians. Together, we will sing the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice, after which everyone is welcome in the glass house to a reception. So right now, please join me in welcoming Jim Nash.
Thank you, Fiona. On behalf of College Church, I'd like to welcome everyone on this cold, blustery day to this event in honor of Black History Month. I am Jim Nash. I am the Ward 3 City Councilor, and for those of you who do not know, you are in Ward 3 right now. So, and it kind of feels good. I also have the honor of serving as the President of City Council, a role I have enjoyed for a little over a year now. Today's special educational event is titled Slavery in Christianity: Jonathan Edwards' Journey from Slaver to Early Abolitionist, and we'll be hearing from both Elizabeth Sharp and Elise Bernier-Feely shortly. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to share some opening remarks, and I'd like to share with you a brief update on City Council matters relative to Black History Month. I'd like to open up this by first thanking the members of our local reparations committee for both their advocacy and the research into historical and current effects of enslavement and racism against Black people in Northampton. Are there any folks here who are part of that reparations group? I think I saw Carolyn here. Could we is there anybody else here, Carolyn? A round of applause for our local reparations group. On February 2nd, City Councilors Jamila Gore, Garrick Perry, and Marissa Elkins introduced legislation that has often been referred to as the Reparations Resolution. In fairness, that's what it was called in the months leading up to introduction, as advocates contacted city councilors and as residents discussed this in various community forums. However, the word reparations appears only twice in the resolution as part of a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. This resolution is not the end of this discussion, but is the starting point of a process towards possible reparations. On February 16th, City Council unanimously approved the resolution to create a commission to investigate racialized harms perpetrated against Black residents and workers in Northampton. I had initially planned to read the entire resolution today, but it is over 6 pages in length, and we have other important matters to get to. I highly recommend that you visit the city's website to review the resolution. Highlights of the resolution are opening quotes by Ta-Nehisi Coates and Heather McGee, a review of racialized harms that have occurred here in Northampton, as well as laudable actions taken by our community to address our shortcomings in the past. Finally, both the mayor and the sponsors commit to delivering a plan specifying the charge and composition of the commission by March 30th, so stay tuned. I'd like to highlight the leadership of this effort. This resolution is sponsored by 3 city councilors, 2 of which are at-large councilors, and 2 of which are this city's 2nd and 3rd black city councilors. The sponsorship by the at-large councilors means that this is a citywide discussion, and I thank Councilors Gore and Elkins for demonstrating their leadership around this matter. The sponsorship by our 2 black representatives, Councilors Gore and Councilors Perry, means we are discussing this matter about black residents with black folks part of the conversation. And I am very grateful for the willingness of Councilors Gore and Perry to lead us in this conversation that I expect at times will be difficult. Lastly, I want to recognize a 4th person in this matter, Mayor G.L. Shera. GL is committed to working with the sponsors to consider a joint commission. A possible model to follow is the Northampton Policing Review Commission back in 2021, which had us creating the new Department of Community Care and also underline our need for our soon-to-be-opened Resilience Hub. We will know more from the mayor and the sponsors by the end of the month. In closing, as the council president, nothing pleases me more than seeing collaboration between city leaders and the residents of Northampton should all feel proud of the work being done around the resolution to investigate racialized harms. Thank you for your time, and I now turn the floor back over to Fiona and Derek.
Thank you, Mr. Nash. Now, before I introduce our very first historian, I'd like to kindly remind you of the 15-minute question and answer session at the end of the presentations. While you're listening to the speakers, and if you have a question that just so happens to pop in your mind, please jot it down so you won't forget it. And now I'd like to introduce our first historian, Elizabeth Sharp. Elizabeth Sharp is the co-director of Historic Northampton. She is a former educator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Elizabeth holds a PhD in history from the University of Delaware and a master's degree in museum studies from the Cooperstown graduate program. She is currently the instructor at the Clemente course in the humanities and adjunct professor at UMass Amherst. She is the author of In the Shadow of the Dam, The Aftermath of the Mill River Flood of 1874, and Amherst, A to Z, 1759 to 2009, and numerous articles. She is the Passport Board President for Amherst and Swift River Valley Historical Societies. Please welcome Elizabeth Sharp.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm not going to show you what this is. Right. So I'm talking about Northampton in the time of Jonathan Edwards. And I should say that Jonathan Edwards was here in Northampton from 1727 to 1750. So we're going way back in time. Now, did it switch? Help me out here. Turned it on. Okay. Whoop. Yeah, I know, but I'm trying to, oh, sorry, I'm trying to switch it, and I don't. Let's just go back. Okay. So I wanted to talk for a minute. Just 70 years before Jonathan Edwards came to Northampton, the whole region looked like this. If you can see that these are the First Nations, these are the indigenous people, these are the native peoples that inhabited this area. And so this is the Connecticut Valley and how they perceived it as a group of small bands of Native Americans living up and down the Connecticut Valley. And I think that, wait a second, this isn't switching. Hold on one second. Oh, dear. Okay, well. One of the interesting things to understand, first off, in understanding history at this point in time, is this idea of the doctrine of discovery. And that's the idea that it's formally written in 1493, but it's an idea that they held, which is that any lands that were not inhabited by Christian people were free to be discovered and to be inhabited by Christians who could then take it over. So this was kind of the theoretical justification for the English to come to America and Connecticut Valley and take hold of the land. Did it advance? Wait a second. So this is what the land would have looked like in Northampton when they came. This is a piece of it. These are blue, this is blue stem, and this is fire tolerant, so that when the native peoples were burning, this grass would grow back. So when the English got here, this land was free of, say, some trees and things, so that they could then begin their planting exercises. All right, so around downtown might have looked like this, the cleared land and native grasses and stands of pine and oak. This is what they were looking for. This is why they settled in this region. And Nonotuck in 1650, just before Jonathan Edwards' family gets here and others get here, it's looking like this. The whole point is that the indigenous people are using the land seasonally and they're moving about. There's not direct ownership of specific pieces. But as soon as the English get here, did it advance? I'm not seeing it advance when I click this thing. Okay. So by 1750, what you see is what I would call the English handprint coming over on the land. So when Jonathan Edwards first comes to town, this is what the town itself is looking like. So here, this is Main Street. This historic Northampton is about here. Main Street is the same Main Street then that it is now. And the church is right here. It's right on Main Street, really close to where it is now. It's all been in the same vicinity. But what you see are, I think it looks like a handprint of English streets just placed on top of this land. And this land here is the Meadows, which is hard to see these days, but it's past, well, it's just out in the back here, isn't it? You probably see it better than anyone. Household heads are granted land according to their usefulness, how many sons they have, what kind of finances they might have. But as time goes by, there isn't enough land for the younger generations. And this is like a central tension in the time of Jonathan Edwards as he's minister. Where does it click from? Oh, back there. All right, got it. All right. So what does town look like? I did? Oh, sorry. Is that right? I don't think that's right. Oh, God. All right. All right. So here's the meeting house that he would have first worshiped in with his grandfather, and he would have been the first minister of. It's called the second meeting house. The first one was more like a very small cabin. And town meetings and religious services are held in exactly the same place. Men and women sit separately. There is a hierarchy, and children, servants, and slave persons are in the balcony above. The sad thing was that when they built the balcony, they didn't do a good enough job of locking the timbers of the balcony into the frame, and over time, as the building became sort of in poor condition, one day during Jonathan Edwards' service in 1737, the balcony collapsed onto the people below. And fortunately, no one was killed, but 10 people were very seriously injured. But that gives you the idea of what a secular building is looking like. Now, the third meeting house, so after that one collapses, a new one had already been partially constructed. What they're doing is they're making a transition to an English style. So I think the first thing to remember is that Jonathan Edwards and all these people who are living there consider themselves British. They are British. They're British subjects. And so they're creating this in the English fashion, and they're seating by rank. So you had a special place to sit. It was established by the town council, basically, of where you should sit in relation to the pulpit. The pulpit is on the long side, and people are sort of sitting in boxes kind of around this way, kind of like the shape of this room. And people with wealth are sitting closer to the minister. It used to be, when they sat the meeting house before, it had to do with age and status. As time goes by, wealth becomes more important in differentiating people. And there's the sense that a hierarchy is good, and that it's something that, as Jonathan Edwards said, God's provision for good order. He was in favor of order, and order involved a hierarchy of people. Okay. The town meetings now have been separated out from the religious services. So this is what they've built. This is the town it looks like at the time he's here. So this is Main Street, literally our Main Street today. So if you were standing here, you'd be at the corner of King Street, Pleasant Street this way, and then this is Main Street up here. It's exactly the same Main Street, which is unusual, but really terrific. So let me move to the next slide, and I've labeled these. So I think the most important thing to note is that Main Street is a tall, steep, rugged road. And they said it's good for sledding. And in fact, until it was kind of knocked down, people walked around to the meeting house from this side because it was an easier way to go. So what was here in his time? The church is here, just kind of on top of the hill. Down here is this new building called a courthouse and the townhouse. So this is where the town meetings are held, no longer in the church. Several houses. The barns are not in back of the houses, they're in front, and the manure is dumped into the road. This is a small saddle shop. Seth Pomeroy owns the house up here. He's a blacksmith, and he's also a military hero. And his tavern and his blacksmith shop are up here. Across the street, there's a jail. And this Hunt house here, one of the Hunts lives in it, is about where Thorne's Marketplace is now. This right here is a board fence. And right down here where Sweeties is today is a small shop, which changes hands and becomes different things. This Pleasant Street is called Bartlett's Lane. But this is the center of town, and that's what it looks like. All right. Oops, I think I missed something. Oh. All right. So what did the houses look like? This is called Parsons House, and it is owned by the historic Northampton. It's right on Bridge Street. You probably passed it coming here today, and maybe pass it 2 or 3 times a day. This is built in 1719, and Parsons was a prominent person. I am certain that Jonathan Edwards was in that house at some point. He must have been. So if you had to look at what a kind of a high-end house looks like in Northampton, this would be it. And probably Edwards' house looks something like this same size. It gives you a sense of what it would look like. And so what is inside these things? I am certain that Jonathan Edwards would have seen this piece of furniture. So this is a dower chest from about 1700, locally made for a local young woman, given to her by her parents. And another aspect of hierarchy is hierarchy within the family. So the man, the husband, is at the top, the wife is second. She's not allowed, women aren't allowed to own property except under certain circumstances, but they are allowed to own textiles and things like that that can be passed from the women's side of the family down to other women. So within this has her name on it. This is one of the few, these dower chests that has her name on it, and the things that are in it would likely go to her daughters. So Northampton is part of the British world. The British Atlantic economy with slavery in it is part of the economy and life of Northampton. They saw themselves as part of that larger world. And so if we are over here, we are trading extensively with the West Indies. Enslaved people are making sugar, cotton, molasses, rum, which is going up to here. Enslaved people are coming from Africa. This sugar, molasses, etc., is going to Great Britain. And it's also big fancy goods are coming back here to North America. You can buy anything in the Atlantic world on Main Street, Northampton. It's all the fancy things from London you can get here by a certain period of time. They are participating in this. And Northampton supports slavery by buying indigo for a blue dye, by buying rum, by enslaving people, and by purchasing these high-end goods. Now, this is hard to see, of course, but I think that representation will give you an idea, which is that, remember I showed you how the house lots looked in Northampton? Everybody gets a small 4-acre lot off of a main street. These little boxes are descriptions of who the enslaved people were in the center core of Northampton. We know, we've tried to figure out at any given time who was living where, but we're just trying to figure that out. So these are arrows to the home lots that we know of. We know that there were 33 enslavers, at least, in Northampton. We know that there are at least 50 enslaved people. Could have been more. People aren't always named. And we know that the town is becoming more and more stratified economically in this period, in the mid-1700s. And what I refer you to is, at Historic Northampton, we spent about 3 years doing something called the Slavery Research Project, and that is all on our website. So if you look on our website, there's a tab that says History of Slavery. Just look at that, and you'll see all the descriptions, every bit of information we could find. You know, it's not like anybody left a complete record of this. Of course not. They were very much trying to kind of erase it or hide it or just not pay much written attention to it. And so what we did is to look at every single piece of paper for the government or for any kind of official capacity that was written in that period, beginning in 1654 when the English first came, up through about 1783. I think between the interns and the staff, everyone looked at like 12,000 pieces of paper, or scrolling on the computer. You know, some of these things are digitized. And the idea was to glean every little fact that you could find and try to knit together a piece. That's how it had to happen. So one example of how slavery is a piece of Northampton is, this is an account book of Ezra Clark. He's a tavern keeper, and he collects the tolls for the ferry. It's right about down the end of Bridge Street here. And he is, in his account book, charging people for stuff. So on this one day, in February 1763, he's charging Stephen Fairfield. Now, Stephen Fairfield comes every 6 months or every year or something, and he stays with him. So he's charging him for horse keeping, okay, your keeping, one ferry trip over, a gill of rum, which is about 4 ounces, lodging 2 men. He must have had a crew with him because he's probably delivering goods from down by New Haven or Hartford or something, a quart of rum, a gill and a half of rum, the ferry trip back, and a pint of rum for the road. So people are drinking a lot of rum, and the water isn't that good, but the rum is coming from the Caribbean, and it is a product of slave culture. And what Northampton farmers are doing is they are growing wheat, and they are fattening cattle, and they are sending it off into New York, to New Haven, and some of it, I am certain, is going to the West Indies to support slave culture. Please think of it, this one whole network, and we're a piece of it. Sugar tongs made in Northampton to put a little sugar in your tea. The sugar, again, from the Caribbean. High-end things in Northampton. And I want to end with this thought, which is that during his time, especially the 1740s and 50s, is a time when the world is changing and new ideas are coming in. And so science, the Enlightenment, rational thinking, reason are the forefront. And there's a time when they're right on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. And what this picture shows is a science party. Well-to-do people would have a party where they would demonstrate electricity. This one demonstrates vacuum tube. And they are talking about new ideas and new ways of thinking. Edwards is interested in this. He's interested in nature, and he's an observer too. So the world is becoming less communal. It's more individualistic. There's more of a stratification socially. And people are more interested in the higher laws, and that it is a higher law that's governing people, as opposed to the idea that it's the minister within your own community and that you can believe his word and follow everything he said. So this is a tension that happens with Jonathan Edwards. And I have this quote here about, to assume the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Do you know where that quote is from? Declaration of Independence. And to my way of thinking, some of the ideas that were kind of coming forth in Jonathan Edwards' time, which kind of led to his dismissal, were some of those early ideas about self-government. And I think we can kind of take his posture and look toward that. As a historic, pardon? To assume the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. So that's the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, because they felt that they should be governed by natural laws. And that's where it was, this is sort of a brief quote of that. So yeah, I think that's, and as a historian, what I like to do is to look at the ideas that people were thinking and try to figure out where they're headed, what might be coming in the future. So that's, and sometimes when there's an incident like the dismissal of Jonathan Edwards, a really serious issue like that, when I look at that, you want to kind of take it apart and say, what are all the parts to it? What were people thinking? How were their ideas changing? And how could this have happened? So for me, it's a really good idea of looking at how Northampton is changing. Northampton then was fundamentally conservative, like it was up until probably about 1960, 65. But it's a place in the British world where ideas are changing. So, and slavery is a part of their culture, and those ideas are slowly changing. So, thank you. Oh, wait. One more. I forgot this. So, what Jonathan Edwards saw, he saw the meadows, which he drew inspiration from, and every Sunday, when he was in church and he looked out, this is what he saw. A sea of blue and white checked shirts. Men wore blue and white checked shirts in the Connecticut Valley. As someone said, you can tell a Connecticut Valley man by his shirt. He wore blue and white check. And somebody who came to town said, in a sea of people in the congregation, there were only 5 or 6 white shirts. So this is linen. The blue is indigo dye, which is a product of slave culture in South Carolina. And for men, this was the shirt. It was also the nightshirt. And when you put your breeches on, it was your underwear, because they didn't wear underwear like we do today. So that's this. And this particular one is reproduction, so you're welcome to take a look at it. Yeah. So that's what he would have seen when he looked out on his congregation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your informative presentation. Our next historian is Elise Bernier Feely. I'll tell you a little bit about her, if you don't mind. Okay. Elise is the Forbes Library, local history, and genealogy historian. She is a frequent guest speaker in the community and presenter of archival exhibits. Her special area of expertise, scholarship, has been on Northampton's most prominent 18th century minister. Guess who? You're right, Jonathan Edwards. Elise holds a Bachelor of Arts in European History from UMass Amherst and a master's degree in library science from Southern Connecticut State University. She is a recipient of the City of Northampton Preservation Award and the Frederick Henry Kramer Award. Currently, she holds the position of board member on the Southampton Historical Commission. Welcome, Elise.
A bit of moving to do because I'm on the lower hierarchy.
Maybe we could move this just a little bit this way. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
This man's a wonder and a marvel, isn't he? I've got all this stuff. My mother used to complain about it. Jonathan Edwards was seriously convinced of the slavery of sin in your life. But he did not fully relate to or recognize that slavery is a sin. Jonathan Edwards was born October the 5th, 1703, in East Windsor, Connecticut. Now, let me just say that that's across the way from South Windsor, and it was what one would consider an Eden, a beautiful area, natural area, green and beautiful, and just perfect for walking, which he did a lot of as a child and also as an adult. When Jonathan Edwards was considering his sermons, and I should mention that if you'd like to do this at some point, he walked along the edge of the Connecticut River here. He was born into a hierarchical, patriarchal family, which in a way represented the whole of Puritan society, hierarchical and patriarchal. His father had graduated from Harvard University. He took his BA and MA, Timothy Edwards, took his BA and MA the same day and got it. You know, I can't even believe that. He took his exams the same day and got them both. He was what one would consider a pedagogue, a teacher. He was not a genius like his son, but what he did was he recognized in Jonathan Edwards that genius. And he latched onto it, perfectionist that he was, and said, this young man, and he was the only son in the family, 11 kids, he was in the 5th notch, right in the middle, of sisters, whom Timothy called they were all 6 feet tall later on when they grew up, including Jonathan. Timothy called them his 60-foot-high daughters, 10 of them. Okay, what I want to just say to you is that from the time that Timothy was very young, he was schooled by his father. His father was also a schoolmaster in East Windsor. About 20 kids came to their house every single day. Most of those were young people, males, who their parents really wanted to be ministers at some point in time. If you were educated, you know it was either a lawyer or a doctor or a minister. So hence, what happened was that he was a busy guy. He was in the pulpit every Sunday, and on Thursdays he had a meeting to discuss people's piety. And the next thing that I want to tell you is this. He had to do farming. He had to do farming because his congregation, which was small, was high on faith, but low on shillings. Really. So what happened to Timothy Edwards was that he got really tired of farming. He was good at it. You know, he had quite an acreage and all sorts of husbandry, you know, all of that. And he knew how to plow and he knew what to do with animals, but he was tired of it. And so, at some point in time, he paid for an enslaved person to come and do farm work for him. This enslaved person probably didn't ever get in the house of Timothy and Esther. Esther was Esther Stoddard. And this person was probably sleeping in a shed or a barn all seasons. And his name was Ascar. And you know, being a genealogist, I just have to know why somebody gets that name. And the reason why he got that name, someone ahead of Timothy, gave him that name. And I looked it up, and I thought, my goodness, Ascar was a 10th century bishop in Sweden and in Germany. And he had 3 claims to fame. He ate bread and water all the time. He was very pious. And the 3rd claim that he had was that he freed slaves everywhere he went. How ironic to name someone that, you know, when they are enslaved. Well, I want to just go ahead and talk about Jonathan Edwards very, very quickly. In New Haven, in 1716, he was 13 years old. Can you imagine being 13 years old? Now, he had memorized everything, including the Bible. And all the books on his father's bookcase, he memorized. Amazing. That's why he probably, you know, used very few notes in the pulpit. He was just an incredibly educated person, but not only that, he analyzed everything that he read. He analyzed it. So, when he was an adult, and he was married to Sarah Pierpont Edwards in Northampton, he spent 13 hours of work at his desk every day. And at that point, he had graduated with a BA and MA from Yale University, and he had gone to New York City to preach. He was given an opportunity to preach, and it was a Presbyterian community that had been divided. He went to preach, and by the way, the spot that he preached on was today's New York Stock Exchange building. God has such a great sense of humor, doesn't he? In any case, he loved it there, and he writes about going out to the Hudson River and seeing all the beauty there. But he doesn't mention, not once does he mention going out to the docks, to the wharf, to see people, enslaved people, being auctioned off. Not once. What was it about Jonathan Edwards and his family and all of the people that he knew, who were the elites of society? What was it then that allowed them to think that they could enslave people? One thing was utilitarian, like his father. I need somebody to help me on the farm, that sort of thing. The other was, I have arrived. I'm a big shot now, so I can have a slave. Literally. You know? And the same thing went for ministers who felt that they needed someone to help. In Northampton, Sarah, for example, was constantly hosting people. All the people that came to sit at the feet of Jonathan Edwards. They came, and I'm talking about ministry students like Samuel Hopkins, who lived in West Springfield originally. And they came and sat at the foot of this incredible genius, and she managed the house. And she also had 11 kids. That's a lot of children. But you see, in those days, the world was diseased more than it is today, except that I'm convinced that COVID is part of that. But in any case, what she did was she managed this huge household. It was big. The wonderful house that Timothy Edwards' father, who was a really wealthy merchant in Hartford, Connecticut, gave his son 3 over 3, this window, this window, this window, and then a window here, and then in the middle of the door, and then another window, and a central chimney. The house just didn't fit East Windsor. It was like a mansion compared to all the congregants that he had. They were all farmers. But here's this beautiful mansion. In any case, what you see in the Connecticut Valley is ministers being the largest number of slaveholders in the Connecticut Valley. Why? Why? Because a minister in the Connecticut Valley and elsewhere had a handle on control, authority. People looked to their ministers for more than just piety. They looked to them as an elite member of society. So, Jonathan Edwards, in 1723, after he came back from New York City and went briefly to Bolton, Connecticut to preach, it's always family. As a genealogist, I can tell you, it's always family. Your family makes you do stuff. I know my father made me. But Timothy Edwards wanted him to be an associate pastor to his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. And when you have that kind of pressure, and by the way, Jonathan Edwards had a lot of pressure on him, not just for his studies. He was gaunt, very tall, very thin, very shy, painfully shy. Oh, yeah, you are too. So, in 1723, prior to the time he came to be with his grandfather, he grew very ill. I think it was a depression. By the way, he loved chocolate all through his life. And guess what? Chocolate got the endorphins going in his brain. See? But he had a lot of that pressure and stress his entire life. He spent almost 3 years sick. One of the things that kept him going was the beautiful Sarah Pierpont Edwards of New Haven, the daughter of James Pierpont Sr. of the Church on the Green. She was schooled by Mary Pierpont Hooker, the daughter of Samuel Hooker, a very famous minister in the Connecticut Valley, and Mary Pierpont Hooker, after she became a widow, James died young. She had several slaves. We know about 2 of them. One was called Jethro. When she died, Jonathan and Sarah were asked to do her estate. And the amount of purchase was in the will. But there was also something else. She manumitted them. She let them go at her death. How long they had been with her? I don't know. When Jonathan Edwards in 1731 decides, after his wife had had 1 child, and then they waited for a little while, 2 years, and then they had another child, I'm sure that Sarah said, I can't do this alone. We're managing this household that is so huge. I mean, every weekend she had someone else to entertain, literally. So I must say that I'm extrapolating all of this. It's not in the documents, but I'm sure that what she said to him was, you need to get me a slave, maybe two. So he did, and he went to Newport, Rhode Island. Newport, Rhode Island, by the way, was the apex of the slave trade and the auction block. And he knew that. But why did he go to Newport? Jonathan Edwards never wasted time. Time was of the essence. Every minute in his day was for study so that he could preach. And so he was asked to go to Boston to do the Harvard commencement address. And guess what? In the middle of that, it was 1731, he was in Boston, and he must have said to himself, I'm going to go to Rhode Island and get Sarah her slave, her enslaved person. And he did, and her name was Venus. And you know, enslaved persons had names that were like code names. Venus was one that stood for a very beautiful black woman. I mean, that's what it stood for. This little girl, and that's what she was about 13 or 14 years old. Can you imagine how afraid she was? She had come from the Caribbean. I don't know what happened on the Middle Passage. I'm assuming that her mother and father had been on the Middle Passage and that they were in the Caribbean too. And she was pulled away from them, torn away from them, made to go somewhere that she didn't want to go. And she was scared. And it was Jonathan Edwards that purchased her now. He had been given a very handsome salary by his congregation, 200 pounds, a lot of money in those days. And he paid $80 for her. 80 pounds, for her. That was like a third of his salary for the whole year. So what was he getting out of it? To his congregants, it was a sign that he had made it. And to himself, it was a sign that he could be obligatory to the woman he loved most, which was Sarah Pierpont Edwards. They were all brought up to believe that slavery was just a part of life. And that tier that Betty talked about, the hierarchy, the ministers, the lawyers, the doctors, and then all the way down. And the last tier was the enslaved. Very hard to even think of that kind of thing today. And how did they, Cotton Mather wrote one of the first two theses on enslaved people and theology, spirituality. And what he wrote was this. Oh, yes, we can baptize them. Baptize them all together, yes. They can, because they are part of God's creation. However, they can't be free on earth. They must be free only in heaven. Now, can you imagine that? Free never on earth, only in heaven. Jonathan Ashley from Deerfield did a panoply of meetings with enslaved people to teach them that that's the way that God wanted it. So that's what people believed. And not only that, but Cotton Mather said, I know you don't like it that they're being baptized because you think that someday they will be free. And he said, don't worry about that. We'll just write it into the law. You see, the law, I'm talking the secular law now, and God's law, the Mosaic law in particular, okay, were wed. And if it said it in the law, in the scriptures, it certainly means that in secular society we can write it in also. So that's how they got away with it. That was their mindset. However, it wasn't everybody. Samuel Sewall, who, by the way, had been a judge at the Salem witch trials, Samuel Sewall wrote a thesis, a tract, on abolitionism in the year 1700. And that tract said, not only are these God's sons and daughters, but they are also your brother and sister. No strings attached. So Samuel Sewall, it's interesting, he was so upset that he had been on the Salem Witchcraft Board, and he was the only one, by the way, who did this. He said at Old First Church, I am so sorry that I did that. Can you imagine? The other ministers, including Cotton Mather, must have had apoplexy over that. You're sorry? But you have the authority to make that kind of pronouncement. He stood in front of the people at Old First Church and said, not only was he sorry, but it was a sin for me to do that. And then, in 1700, he wrote The Selling of Joseph, which said, we have no right to enslave other human beings. So, Cotton Mather said something that, they certainly could be baptized, but he didn't say, we should not enslave anyone. George Whitefield, who was best friends with Jonathan Edwards, came to America, and when he saw in Boston the slave market, made all sorts of remarks about how it shouldn't be. But later, of course, he was an itinerant. Oh, by the way, I love this, so I'm going to share it with you. He had this basso voice, and of course he used his hands like I do. And he said, they said about him, women would faint at the word Mesopotamia from his lips. Yes, I love that line. But look, when he went to Georgia and he wanted to found, and it was a good thing that he wanted to do this, he wanted to found a school for orphans. That was a good thing. The bad thing was that someone there convinced him that, if you have this orphanage, you have to have somebody to do the work. And so George Whitefield accepted slavery, having said that it was verboten. And he bought land in South Carolina from a slaveholder, and he said, put them to work so that they will give my orphans more food. Who were them? The enslaved people. So you see, Some of it was utilitarian, and some of it was theological, but all of it was bad. Sin. We know all about that. I certainly do. When I was little and I was doing something bad, my mother would say, "Elise, where are you?" And I would say, "I'm here." And she would say, "And what are you doing?" And I would say to her, "Nothing." And then she knew. She knew I was doing something. Then Benjamin Coleman, who was his dear friend, who said, by the way, that Puritans were too melancholy and that they should learn to laugh. I love that. Benjamin Coleman had booked passage on a ship to go to London to preach when he was a very young man. And there were privateers on the sea, and those privateers captured him. And he spent almost 3 years in a French prison. Now, I'm French by heritage, and I know what those prisons were like. I've studied French history. They were horrible. But he came back home, they let him out, and he came back home and became the pastor of the Brattle Street Church, which was kind of liberal in those days. You know, he had to prove himself to people like Increase Mather and Cotton Mather. But he did. He proved himself. And then he became Jonathan Edwards' friend, and he edited a faithful narrative of the amazing occurrences in Northampton, Massachusetts, about the revival, the first revival. Now, he had spent all that time in prison, but he owned 3 slaves. He owns 3 enslaved people. How could he do that? He had been locked up in one of the worst prisons around, and he owned 3 enslaved people. Okay. One last thing, and then you'll say, "Oh, good, she's not talking anymore." The last thing was the Doolittle case. It happened during the time that Jonathan Edwards wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and he was absolutely upset about the fact that, A, his salary wasn't being paid, and so he could not have the kind of life he and his wife and children wanted, and he was also a slave owner. He had a number of slaves. I think that it was maybe 7 or 8 in all of his life. I'm going to be brief now. The Hampshire Association of Ministers was a convention of ministers in the valley. By the way, there were 24 slave-holding ministers in this valley. 24. Everybody had an enslaved person, maybe one or several. So, the Hampshire Association had a problem, and that was that Mr. Doolittle, Reverend Doolittle of Northfield, had slaves, and his people didn't like it. And so they said to Jonathan Edwards, "Write us up a brief about this." And of course, the people who disliked the fact that he had enslaved persons also disliked the fact that there were salary issues, and that was a big one for Jonathan Edwards at that point in time. So, Jonathan said, "You know, all you people, you brethren out there who are upset about enslaved people being with your ministers, you know, you're just as culpable as he is." Why are you just as culpable as he is? because you believe in the benefits of your life. And all the benefits of your life come from slavery. Everything. You're hypocrites. That's what you are. He said, if you want to change things, you need to stop the slave trade. That's what you need to do. Now, he knew he was a slave owner, but he hit the nail on the head when he said, you're complaining? Don't complain. Do something about the slave trade. End it if you don't like this. Now, that was the beginning of what we call the transitional period, which Betty talked about, where people were beginning to think that slavery was a bad thing. So, the other issue was the authority of the minister. He said, there needs to be respect for your minister. Now, he had no respect in Northampton at all anymore. He just didn't. So what did he zero in on? These, by the way, these were the guys that owned 700, 600 acres. They were the elite. They were the ones who complained. And he knew that. And so he said, look, if you do this, if you dismiss your minister, you will wound religion. That's the word that he used. We will see that you wound religion. Why? Because the authority of the pastor in New England was going down, and Edwards knew it. Now, I want to just say one more, and I can see Marcia back there. I'll be good. I want to say just one other thing. Think of it yourself. Jonathan Edwards wasn't a bad man, but he did have bad ethics on that score. You know, he knew that slavery to sin, as I started my talk, was absolutely verboten, but he did not know that to enslave somebody was notoriously, horribly bad. One thing I would like to also add to that, Marcia, I'm going to stop now. I told her to hang up her hand, you know, if I was going to, because I'm very loquacious, as you can tell. This was not 21st century Northampton. This was 18th century Northampton. Jonathan Edwards' son became one of the most ardent abolitionists of his time in the next generation, along with Samuel Hopkins, who was his greatest pupil. Where did that come from? There must have been kind of a sea change. There must have been. Edwards had said, the slave trade is the actual linchpin of all of this. So it's transitional. He was a slave owner until his death, but he was thinking about things. Before he went to get Venus in Newport, he looked at Job chapter 1, which said, we are all God's children. The night before he went, he had to have been thinking about that. Maybe he wasn't happy about doing what he did. I don't know. But we are all God's children. children, and we are all equal in the sight of God. He was beginning to see that. Praise God for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your incredible knowledge of, thank you for sharing your knowledge of Jonathan Edwards. Would you join us for the question and answer portion of our session here? Okay. So if you have a question in the audience, thank you. You can you raise your hand, and we'll have Miss Fiona. And I think I got David's mic, actually. If you can just speak clearly into the mic so we all can hear the question, that would be great.
I was just curious why they didn't hire servants rather than buy slaves. Was that not part of the culture?
Yes, it was. You could rent out your slave. Isn't that awful? Somebody else needed some labor, and you got quite a bit of remuneration for that. And Jonathan Edwards did that, just like they all did.
I think she was asking, why didn't you just hire somebody instead of enslaving someone?
Boy, that's difficult, because they did hire in the beginning indentured servants, indentured white servants. But that became less important than the slave trade, which Betty talked about. They needed more people to do more work, and that was essentially it.
Well, then you can say, if they needed more people, why enslave them? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to get labor. You don't do the thing, you don't buy the thing, or not. They could have easily done that. I think it was condoned.
Fiona? You have a question up here.
Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I've been impressed because there have been two recent publications on these issues. Susan Stinson, from, the author, she might even be here in the round, has written, she lives in Northampton, and she has written a book about Jonathan Edwards, which is just fantastic. What you have said here is all really packed into her book about Jonathan Edwards. And then there is a more recent book, forget now the name of the author, but it's called Firsting and Lasting, about this theory of, there was empty land and it was all up for grabs, and we just took care of it, not making any room, mental space for the fact that there were Native American Indians. It's a wonderful book, and there were issues that you touched upon that reminded me of that book. I can only say, I invite everybody. Many people have probably read that book or these books. I can only...
She spoke at the
Historical Society. At the Historical Society. She spoke about firsting and lasting, and I saw that. So I just wondered, given what you talked about today, I'm still struggling. How did these evils of slavery that were part of this culture and this so-called church, Christianity, how did they impact the history of New England, of America? I mean, the legacy must be still noticeable and in what we call the racial issues in our society. I wish we had maybe would have talked a little bit about that. You know, this was what you pointed out was just very historical back then. But I'm very interested in finding out more about what the impact of Jonathan Edwards and this theory of uninhabited land, how it has influenced our world, our politics, our social relationships.
I think that's a lot of questions in there. I think it impacts everything. It's the basis of understanding everything. It's the worldview. And when a worldview is in a certain way and people see their world that way, that's what happens. I think one of the things about Native peoples, I'll just say about Native peoples and disease. So often you hear that, or the theory was at the time that many died of flu, and you know, I think what other, smallpox, you know, other kinds of diseases which many of the Europeans were slightly immune to or had had before, malaria, and so they must be weak, and therefore we are deserving of taking their land, which is totally a bogus way of thinking. But recent research has taken that to task, and they're saying, no, I think yes, certainly there was some death related to disease, but look at it another way. When you start taking people's lands and they start, there's a slide I didn't use, they start pushing up against other groups, there's a lot more tension, there's less food supply, there's political tensions, and therefore there's a lot more warfare and people are dying of that. Perhaps that's the cause of it. So I think they wanted to see people in other ways and not as humans. They had that hierarchical view of the world. Up through the 19th century. Oh, one other thing, you're asking about legacy. So I think it's important to look really specifically at time. Like I said, we did the Enslaved Persons Project, and we went up to about 1783 when slavery becomes mostly illegal in Massachusetts. And what we were looking at was what happened to the people who were enslaved and then freed in Northampton. Where did they go? And one of the things, we don't quite know yet, but what it seems to me is people either didn't stay, they went other places, and in many cases they were warned out of town. They were basically, they were not welcome. And so some went to Springfield and then they were warned out there and then came here and warned out again. And so you don't see a population continuing. And so I have a big question about what happens then and what is the mindset of removing that population entirely. I will say some people did stay, of course, but some did not. Most did not, it appears.
I just want to back up and say this, that the English, besides the fact that they were very sure of their theology, they were also very sure of their law, English law, so that when John Pynchon, for example, from Springfield, decided to develop Northampton, he drew up a contract with Chickwallop, who was the main sachem, the indigenous sachem. And that contract gave everything to the English. And Chickwallop put his symbol, by the way, you can see that at Forbes. We have a book that shows it. Put his symbol there, not knowing that his idea about the land was, Chickwallop now, was this, that the land, we'll share it with you. We'll show you where we fish. We'll show you how to plant corn, which they call maize. We'll do everything we can to accommodate you. But they didn't know that the English thought, and they did it deliberately, obviously, this is going to be our land now. It's not yours. They didn't know that initially. And then when they woke up, they were very sure of themselves. Metacomet, who was called King Philip by the English. By the way, he was called King Philip because they said that he reminded them of Philip of Macedon. Isn't that incredible? Anyway, Metacomet said, we're going to take back our land. And that's where King Philip's War came from. They finally got tired of seeing everything being encroached.
And after the war, the Nonotuck and other people, native peoples in this area, removed to Skagit-Coke, which is around the Albany area. It was essentially a refugee camp for all the indigenous people from this area. Many of them moved there. And some of them stayed, of course, but many moved there.
Can I go? Thank you both so much for sharing all that you shared. I had a question, and maybe I missed it in the presentation, but the title of this was Jonathan Edwards' Journey from Slaver to Early Abolitionist, and at the end you were talking about him being a slave holder till the end of his life. So I'm a little confused. Where's the early abolitionist aspect of him? Because it doesn't sound like, he does not sound like an abolitionist to me.
And he wasn't. He definitely was not. His son was, but not he. And Samuel Hopkins, his pupil, was. But he was transitional because he said in that Doolittle case, if you want to end slavery, stop the slave trade. That was a big, big lift to what he was saying in terms of later abolitionism. Later.
But as we know, that didn't stop slavery.
We have one last question.
I just wanted to comment before I ask the question that what you say, he says, if you don't want slavery, get rid of the slave trade. Sounds a little like Bernie Sanders saying, if you want fair health care, get rid of the, have health care for all and get rid of the profit making. It sort of sounds like the same thinking. Anyway, my question is, you mentioned that at a certain point, they didn't look up to him anymore, and they didn't like him. And I understand he was fired, and I realize I should go read books. But while you're here, what was the dispute about it? He went to Stockbridge, right? And they liked him there. So what was the beef?
It was theological. His grandfather had promoted something called the Halfway Covenant, which said that the Lord's Supper was a converting ordinance. That means if you took the Lord's Supper into your heart, God would somehow quicken you and you would have a conversion experience. That was one part of it. There were two other parts which we don't have to go into. Jonathan Edwards preached that when he first came. Everybody was preaching Halfway Covenant in this whole valley except for Edward Taylor of Westfield, who disliked it intensely. He wanted to be a full covenant man. Full covenant meant you don't get to vote in the church, you don't get to baptize your children, and you don't get to take the Lord's Supper unless you have a conversion which the pastor sanctions. In other words, they look at, what you're doing. First of all, you have to have total depravity. You have to meditate on how bad you are. Yeah. Well, I'm a Catholic, and that's what we do today.
We have one last comment, not a question.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my name is Joshua Castillo. I'm a PhD candidate in African history at Boston University. And I had a few comments here. I think it's really important as we discuss Jonathan Edwards, here in Northampton. Something that we haven't really discussed is this important role of greed, right, within this. Because the reality is there weren't alternatives. I think as you were recognizing, there were alternative beliefs, and Jonathan Edwards, right, as a brilliant white intellectual Christian, he could read a lot, right? He had these alternatives, and he chose to enslave people and to continue that. And also, I think if we read his justifications, like, we need to recognize where he's coming from as somebody who is placing himself on this moral pedestal as a Christian preacher, but then also using these kind of hypocritical defenses to justify and uphold slavery, right? So I think that's a really important part of the conversation. And I also wanted to recommend, there's a great book by Jamar Tisby called The Color of Compromise, which looks at this kind of long and very difficult question of racism within American Christianity, white American Christianity. And that's something I think that we should really, kind of be aware of, that like Jonathan Edwards, right, was somebody that, if you're thinking of being here in Northampton, is so important to our history, but I feel like there's still a lot of work to do to reckon with that really deep hypocrisy, and the fact that such a leader was greedy, right? And maybe he could justify it. He had the brilliance to justify that. But within this broader unfortunately Christian tradition, that's a legacy that we really need to, I think, grapple with more. So.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Our question and answer period is now over. Thank you, ladies.
That brings us to the conclusion of our question and answer portion of the program. We'd like to show a nice video, if you will.
At the dawn of the 20th century, America was a country full of promise and hope for many. Black Americans faced a different reality, a nation separate and unequal. Yet their hope persisted. Pained by inequality, but inspired by resilience, writer and civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson put pen to paper. His words would become a unifying call, a hope for a brighter tomorrow, a timeless exhortation to lift every voice and sing.
There are forces that want to take us back to another place. We don't want to go back. We want to go forward.
I'd like to introduce David Dembski, who will lead us into the singing of the Black National Anthem. If you are able, please stand if you can.
Good afternoon. Just by way of introduction here, I've been a Christian, will be 40 years come this November, and I've been in music pretty much that whole time, and I had never heard of the Black National Anthem until this year. And I don't know where it's been my whole life, but it's pretty powerful, and so if you have not heard it, I hope you enjoy it.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the sea. Sing was cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee, shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. Amen.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Elizabeth and Elise, for sharing your scholarship with us. Thank you to all our volunteers who worked so hard to make this day possible. Thanks to you, our audience, for asking good questions. And finally, I'd like to thank College Church for sponsoring and hosting this event. For all who want to linger, the Glass House is the place to be. And here now is College Church pastor Bill Hodgman to close us in a benediction.
Thank you, friends. This is a great reminder that there's this thing called blind spots. Jonathan Edwards had them. We have them. Our grandchildren will be all too eager to point them out to us as we take our final breaths. What is the solution of that? Well, there isn't one. What can grease the skids to a whole host of solutions? Humility. Humility. So, may God grant us the humility to search our hearts, to admit when we are wrong, to sit at others' feet, to relate to and learn from those who are different than we are, and to honor our neighbors as those who bear God's image and likeness. Go in peace.